Hi, welcome to the show today. That's Paul Laverne, registered psychotherapist and sexual recovery therapist. And I'm here today to talk to Hennes Doltze. Hennes was a program manager with the Salvation Army, Correctional and Justice Services in Winnipeg, Manitoba. For the last 7 years, he has worked with men who have exploited vulnerable people for sex or who have been abusive toward their intimate partner. Hennes believes that in order to create safety and security for women, it is essential to work with men to combat sexual exploitation and domestic violence. He has a strong interest in social justice and advocacy and has held various positions in probation, child welfare, and the mental health field in Canada, as well as in Germany, his native country. Hennes, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Paul, for having me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so do I. Let's jump right into it and tell me how you got involved in working with sex buyers.
Yeah, so it's an interesting topic, obviously, and the way I got involved was through the work with the Salvation Army. So when I started the job in 2012, I knew the agency a little bit already because I had done my field placement there, but I was hired as the program manager for the domestic violence program for men, as well as for the program for the prostitution offender program, or as some people refer to it as John School. And to be quite honest, it wasn't really my career choice, or that I was looking forward to it in a sense of, yeah, this is the type of people that I want to work with.
When you were 5 years old and they said, what do you want to be when you grow up? You didn't say, I want to work with sex buyers?
No, not really. Yeah, because it's obviously an odd, it's an odd job in some ways, but you know what I had realized over the time that I was working in the field was the absolute necessity and just the type of topic, and I think engaging with men really in the end grew on me, and the need for this kind of work, and coming at it always from an angle of trying to support people, trying to help people while holding them accountable, but also because I think it focuses on something that we often don't recognize. When we talk about domestic violence, when we talk about sexual exploitation or prostitution, I think we often come from it from an angle of a feminist or an issue for women, right? So rather than an issue that involves men as well, we as a society, we generally see it more as, women are impacted by domestic violence and by sexual exploitation, which obviously they absolutely are, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I found that working with men is absolutely crucial in those areas as well. Not only because I think there's an area to make change, but also because of some of the dynamics that men have or carry with them, where they end up either being abusive to their partner, whether it's with domestic violence or the whole exploitation issue, around prostitution and sex buyers. So,
I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that,
yeah.
Because if we look at it as let's say a supply and demand, so the product is sex provided by women. Isn't it safe to say the only reason that a market for that, the only reason a market exists for that is because there's a demand, and the demand is created by the men.
Absolutely.
So don't we have to address the demand from men for paid sex to really address the issue of prostitution in a long-term, meaningful way?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And when you look at it sort of as a triangle, you have on one side, you have the women, the supply, even though obviously they're not supply in that sense, but when we use those market, those market analogies, you have the women as supply. You have sometimes the traffickers or exploiters that force or lure somebody in, and then the other side of the triangle, you have the demand, which is predominantly made up of men. There's a small percentage of women, but it's overwhelmingly men who buy sex. Like in our program, when I was the manager, I think we had one woman that was arrested for purchasing sex, and she never entered into the program. So the overwhelming majority is men. And like you said, if we address that, or if we pay attention to that and focus on that, I think that's, going forward, the area that really needs to be paid attention to in order to make a significant change.
And yes, Hennes, thanks. And let's just clarify what the law is for viewers that don't know, because until I looked into this, I had no idea if prostitution was legal or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you just speak to that for?
Yeah. So I have to give a little bit of a background, obviously, and when I talk about the law, it obviously refers to the laws in Canada as they are.
Right. And is it the same across the country? Because you're in Winnipeg, I'm in Ontario. Yeah. I think though Bill C-36 is uniform across the country, correct?
That is correct. Yeah. So it's a federal law. The government in I believe it was 2015, changed the laws. Now, to go back a little bit into how prostitution was seen prior, it was actually illegal if it happened in a public place, but it wasn't seen as a sort of an exploitation issue. It was seen as a nuisance. So if in an area, in a part of town, people would be stopping and chatting with women for sex. If that happened, that was a criminal offense already up until 2014. Okay. If it happened in a private home, if it happened, somebody calls somebody else up or sends an email, that wasn't illegal. So it was seen as a nuisance. We don't want this in the public eye. We want to protect the community and the dignity of the community. But it changed after a court challenge, the so-called Bedford case, which went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court made a decision that government had to implement new laws. And at that time, the government instituted what we would call a Nordic or an equality model. So rather than decriminalizing all of the sex industry or prostitution, one side was criminalized, which is the purchase of sex, and the sale of sex was decriminalized. Right. And the main reason for that was to recognize and to understand and pay tribute to the reasons why women, again predominantly women who are selling sex, end up in that trade. And so the choice was made to criminalize buyers and to decriminalize women, and rather seeing them as criminals who need to be, arrested or involved in the justice system. The focus shifted to more of a support and a help rather than a criminalization. And the men, again, the purchasers would be criminalized. So that is based in some ways on the Nordic model, which has been adopted in Sweden, in Norway, in some other countries. There's different terms for it. Some people call it the equality model. But what it really does is to say, okay, like you mentioned earlier, the demand is the driving force for sexual services, therefore for trafficking, and the government decided to do that.
Because why? I guess the thinking is, why penalize and punish and incarcerate women who are often coerced into it, controlled by their pimps, engage in prostitution under the threat of duress or harm to themselves. And many of them we know are using drugs and alcohol to cope with the trauma, and many are also traumatized. So rather than punish them, let's get them some help and an exit strategy and help them to rebuild skills to enter into a productive life. And let's focus on penalizing the source of the demand for this criminal enterprise, which are the Johns.
That's right.
Thinking, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thinking. And when the law was instituted, it didn't get applied equally across the country. And when you look at different cities and different provinces, and you talk to crown prosecutors or police, they'll have a differing opinion on whether it should be enforced or not. So the law is one element of it. The enforcement is obviously another one.
I've heard from people that in some jurisdictions, it's a dead law on the books, really, that's not enforced at all.
That's right. That's right.
And in Ontario, in the last 5 years since they brought the law, and I've heard maybe of one or two John sweeps, where they've actually gone out and tried to arrest Johns.
Right.
What's it like in Winnipeg? Are they enforcing it at all, or even trying to?
Yeah, so Winnipeg is in some ways unique, and because we have a very strong community aspect and community agencies, often under the leadership of indigenous communities and community leaders,
Okay.
where the police still regularly enforce the laws. So that would mean that it's all the way up to the highest level of the police, and they say, okay, we're committed to protecting women, protecting often young indigenous women and girls, and so, but there's also a sense of unity around this topic for the most part, where community agencies, agencies that support survivors and women and girls that are exploited through the sex trafficking and prostitution, that there's a strong support for that, to say, hey, in this city and in some ways in this province, we don't just turn a blind eye to the demand side. We are committed to that, and this is one tool and one element that we want to focus on. I know the London police in Ontario also in the past couple of years have been enforcing the laws, but I know, for example, Montreal or even Vancouver, it's all the way from the police level leadership not being enforced, and there's different political reasons for that. Obviously,
isn't there always?
Sorry, say that again.
Oh, I said, isn't there always?
Yes, absolutely, right.
Yeah.
But for us here, historically, it's been always a topic, and there's always been strong community support and public support for this kind of enforcement as well. So
that, I guess that's interesting. The rest of the country can learn from that in terms of, like, it's not as simple as make the police enforce the laws and end prostitution.
Right.
Okay, let's start with that. And let's have community agencies that are also waiting and willing to help women who want to exit out of that. And let's have people that want to work with the Johns, either therapists like myself or John schools, and all across the board. So there's 3 or 4 or 5 different levels here, and different agencies or groups of people that need to all work together and support each other in dealing with that. Let's talk about how does the John exactly get to you? Mm-hmm. And then, what is a John school? And let's talk about the profile. Is there a typical profile of a John? Because, there's this conception out there that, it's creepy men in trench coats and stuff like that. And we know that that's not the case, right? So let's talk about that.
Sure, yeah. So how somebody would get into our program. So as I mentioned, the police would enforce the laws here.
Okay.
Which means any attempt, not only the purchase is a criminal or is a criminal offense, but the attempt already. So if police do their enforcement investigations, and if they arrest somebody where they believe that an attempted transaction has happened, if the person is eligible, which means that he does not have any kind of prior criminal record regarding sexual offenses or violent offenses, then he would be eligible. He would be sent to us with the approval of the Crown Attorney. So you have another level of the justice system that needs to be in approval of that, and they would be referred to us, and then their car gets impounded at the time of the arrest, and they would meet with me or with one of our staff to conduct an intake meeting. And in the intake,
how do they actually get arrested? What happens?
So it would be with what they call sting operations. So there's a police investigation, and where somebody would be, positioning themselves maybe on the street or posting something online. And then if there's a response from a person that indicates, okay, I'll offer you $20 for a blowjob or something else, and a police do these setups, then there's a an arrest that would happen, and then at that point, eligibility would be determined, and then they would be sent to us. So it is active enforcement through the police. At the time of the intake, what we really want to do is to build a relationship and to build a rapport with the person, because we strongly believe, sort of from a philosophical point of view, is to say, okay, we're going to get much further if we approach this in a way that is based on dialogue and engagement, rather than sort of full punitive and shameful approach with the guy. So, and this starts right off the bat with the intake meeting, where we lay out what are the requirements for the program. So they would have to attend an educational seminar. They have to pay a fee of $800. If their income is less, then we would be able to adjust it. But generally, the fee of $800. They would have to do some volunteer hours, and they would have to do a closing meeting. So it's a very short-term oriented program. It's not a long-term therapy, but it's primarily based on education and on really looking at it and giving people the chance to learn about some of the myths and misconceptions that people have, but also the realities of the sex trade. And one important aspect in the interview is also that people would have to accept responsibility for their actions. So if they deny and, oh no, I was just asking for directions, or I was wondering if she needed help or so, but if there's no responsibility and the guy says, hey, listen, this was all a setup and I didn't say anything to her, then I would say, okay, you need to take this to a lawyer, or maybe deal with it through the regular court system. So that level of
take them into the program then if they're not taking ownership for their actions.
And that's a legal requirement. On one hand, it's a legal requirement. So by law, because we operate under the criminal code, as what we call a diversion program or an alternative measures program.
Right.
If they would have to take responsibility from a legal side. But there's also another, maybe more of a social work side, or where we say, okay, if you say that you didn't do anything wrong, then you don't need to be in this program. So that level of responsibility is sort of the first step of engaging and acknowledging, maybe, this wasn't the right decision, or, sort of a first opening to say, okay, maybe this is a chance for you to reconsider that. If there's absolutely none of that, then we would say, okay, legally, you can't enter into the program. And maybe if indeed this was not your, not what actually happened, you shouldn't be held responsible for that. So, right, it's a legal protection for the client. But for us, if they do take responsibility, and most of them do, at least at one point, some may be very hesitant, or they think they can just deny it and then still attend the program. And I say, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that, right? Because often the initial response is to deny, is to blame somebody else, is to say, well, she lured me in. It's not for them to take a look at themselves, but it's to point fingers, to try and get out of it, In some ways, it's a human response, right? So those are the requirements, and then they would have to obviously follow through with the program aspect of it,
So it's an intake, a seminar, and then a follow-up session. Is that the whole program?
That's right. And then in addition to that is the fee. So the funding is basically coming from the participants of the program. There is no government funding that's being dispersed into this, but the fee covers the program cost, and interestingly enough, a portion of that fee goes back to providing services to women to help them exit the sex trade. So we always see it sort of from a restorative justice point of view, almost, where they are their fees are helping women in their transition, in their recovery, in other kind of support services that Salvation Army would offer.
So is there a typical profile of a sex buyer, or do they come from all walks of life? What have you found?
Very, very good point. So the only typical, I think, identifier is that the people that are in the program are males. If I would really have to break it down. Now, here in Winnipeg, we live in a very multicultural city. So you have people from basically all corners of the world, newly arrived immigrants, that have only been here a couple of months or maybe a year. You have Canadians that have lived here all of their lives. And really a very diverse group of people. We have obviously, different age groups. And the majority is sort of in that age group, 25 to 40. That's the biggest group. But we've had people that were barely 18. We've had a number of guys, who are in their early 80s, and so the spectrum of the age groups is really, really wide. When you look at
how about educational or socioeconomic backgrounds?
Yeah. So socioeconomically, the majority of people in the program would be working. About 85% are, have a job. They're employed in various settings. About 6% are retired, and then the rest would be either unemployed or without a job. But it's actually the smallest group. And when you look at it, it makes sense because you need to have a certain level of income and disposable income to pay for sex, right? So somebody who's on, who's working is in a position to do that, rather than somebody who's on, assistance or who has a very small income.
And how many of them are married or in a committed relationship?
Yeah, so we did a little bit of a case study a couple of years ago where we were looking at exactly those questions, and we found out that of our participants, there was about 42% of people in the program that were either married or in a common law relationship, so boyfriend, girlfriend, those kinds of things.
I thought that would have been higher, less than half, eh?
That's for our sample, it's less than half, yeah.
And
then
I would have guessed 60 to 70%, but
there's also a fair amount of people where we didn't quite know when we interviewed them, and obviously them sharing their information is voluntarily. So there's a number, about a third, where we were not quite sure, or it's just unknown for us, where we don't know, okay, are they married? Are they in a relationship? So they just didn't disclose that to us.
Oh, it could be higher than 42%.
It could definitely be higher, yeah. And then for about 15%, we're single. I just looked at the numbers again. So, so there's a group of people where we are not quite sure. Okay, are they married? What's their relationship status? So it could be high, up to 50%. Which is, again, there's 50% of the people have a relationship, and those things are impacted, and their partners are impacted by this as well, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to. So my one question of what do you teach in this seminar, and then I want to talk about how they think, like how sex buyers think.
Yeah.
You pick which one you want to address first, or how because I imagine they tie together somehow. So
they absolutely do. So what we have found is it's always helpful to have professionals talk about, it's professionals and experiential people to talk about the issues of prostitution from a specific perspective. So what we usually do at the beginning of the seminar is we open up the conversation and just ask, why do men buy sex? We want to sort of lay the groundwork for that day and for the seminar and say, okay, first of all, we want to engage with you. And therefore, because people come in the morning and they're all, closed up and they sit down like this and they look down, right? And they don't want to talk with anybody. So, and we really want to break the ice around that. So we take about an hour in the morning just to set the tone, set the stage, and ask that kind of question, why do men buy sex? And I want to come back to that a little bit later.
Okay.
And then we have two professionals, one from the Crown Attorney's office. So she would be she or he would be the prosecuting person who is basically in charge of the file and looks at really, okay, what is the law, what does the criminal code and the law say about purchasing sex and prostitution? So again, like you mentioned earlier, not everybody, in fact, majority maybe even of Canadians are not aware of what the legal requirements and the legal situation for that is.
Right.
So there's a presentation on what is legal, what is illegal, what are the potential implications if somebody gets arrested, all the way to fines, prison time, and if it's a repeat offense, then obviously it would escalate the punishment. But also the issue of if somebody tried to purchase sex from somebody who's under the age of 18, which is obviously considered child abuse, that carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 6 months, irregardless of whether that person knew that this person was underage or not, right? Which is all
just attempting
just the attempt to do. That's right.
Months. That seems light. That seems light, eh?
It in some ways it does, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's the conversation already. It's not the actual act for paying for sex, but it's the conversation and the engagement on that level already.
Yeah.
And then we have somebody from the Winnipeg police who does a presentation and say, okay, what are the implications of the sex trade and exploitation and trafficking on the community? What is the situation of the women that end up in the sex trade? And we can dive into that a little bit later. So they look at it from different sides. They look at it also from a perspective of safety, even for the men, because there's also situations in the past where men were actually the buyers were potentially victims of a crime as well, right? And so it's really this this dangerous situation that a person can put themselves in, and often obviously the level of violence is directed towards women, but it's not unheard of that it could also be directed the other way. So police talk about that, and then we have somebody from a child protection agency. There's a large program or strategy here in Manitoba called Tracia's Trust, and a representative from that office talks about how kids and youth, particularly girls, end up in the sex trade and they're being lured, obviously through online predatory behavior, and then when they are 14, 15, 16 or 17, and then all of a sudden they become adults. Well, they started when they were or were lured into it when they were younger, right? So there's always this crossover, and it's also a way for men to be educated about what are potential consequences to them if there's an investigation that the child welfare officers would do on their own lives, and the harm that this causes to young people, right? I think sometimes people are oblivious to that. They don't want to know that because they're just so focused on their own desire or pleasure or fantasy in that, and they don't care, well, is she 17? Is she 18? Is she maybe 14? And it's very hard to know these days how old somebody is, whether
by looking at them. Yeah, you can't just
by looking at them, especially with all of these filters on Instagram or on these different platforms. And somebody who is maybe 14 could easily pass with the right makeup and the right, photography, could pass as 18 or even older,
Is there anyone, an exited woman from the sex trade that will also talk on these panels?
Yeah. So we have usually two experiential women that will talk, and that is often in the afternoon, because then we really focus on, okay, let's bring it down from the impact that this has on you, sort of from a general perspective, to, okay, here are two individuals who have lived that kind of lifestyle, who struggled through it and who have exited, and they're able to share their own experiences. And that is a very personal and often a very emotional testimony that they share, and it often reaches the men on a different level, more than I can do, more than
Right.
a police officer can do. And if we talk about, okay, you shouldn't be doing this, but this is a personal story. This is somebody's.
Is this where you see an emotional impact or
Absolutely,
a
absolutely.
rise, a bit of empathy coming
Yeah,
out in these men? Yeah.
yeah. Not from everybody, of course, but
Right.
for certain segment, I would absolutely say yes. And that's often, when we do an evaluation and a recap of the day individually with the men, that's often what sticks out in their mind, is those stories, because it's very honest, very raw, and the women share some of their stories about growing up in poverty, growing up often with abuse or sexual abuse,
Right.
and then the challenges that they face, but also some of the things where they kind of started to play a role and act in the industry to maintain that kind of level of distance, but they often say, well, this was all an act, this was all a show. I never enjoyed it once. I knew that I had to do it to get the money,
Mm.
maybe to pay for my drugs. So it's sort of peeling back the layers and some of the masks that are being put out, and so those are very, very impactful. We do also have somebody who is a former sex buyer, and he shares his own personal story
Oh,
around this.
wow.
And we've had
Right.
him for a number of years. And again, he brings another level to this, and his story is a little bit different. So he wasn't sort of a regular consumer or a regular purchaser, but he, at least in this, in the beginning, thought he would actually be able to develop a relationship with one of the women,
Yeah, that's
and
quite
sort of,
common too, right?
yeah, I had sort of this fantasy, and I
Yeah,
mean, there was
my
some.
girlfriend almost like the
Yeah,
girlfriend
like my girlfriend, that's right. And then he felt he needed to help her.
right.
And so, and he shares like how sort of his thinking, was really kind of twisted around this, that he could help her, that this could be a regular relationship. And obviously she struggled with her own challenges. But he's come a long way and is pretty honest about the man, what it took for him, to undergo some counseling, to be honest with his family, with his mom at that point when she was still alive, and with his sister, right? So he's very vulnerable in that sense of saying, hey, this is my story. I don't have a problem sharing it with it. But it wasn't an easy story, but I've come far, far away from where I used to be, So again, it's an ability, and it's a chance for the man to relate to some of, maybe not all of those things that he talks about, but some of
Yeah.
those elements
Well,
that.
it sounds like you're bringing in enough levels of
Right.
analysis and experience that something's going to impact them. Like it may be the
Right.
legal implications, it may be the stories
Yeah.
from women, it may be like the former sex buyer, and they're thinking, man, like
Yeah.
that's exactly how
Yeah.
I thought or how I think. And
That's right.
and to hear that there's maybe something better, like
Yeah.
a life without paying for sex.
That's
That's a
right.
better
Yeah.
option, right? So
Yeah.
wow, that's it sounds like you do a great job of coming at it from all the different aspects of, instead of just some guy that gets them in there and
Yeah.
tells them they're a piece of shit for doing this and you have to stop,
Right. Right.
right?
And we wanted to make sure, because we have such a diverse group of people, we wanted to make sure, okay, that the voices that we bring to the table, somehow something will resonate with some of the guys in this.
Sure.
And when we do the evaluations at the end, that's usually what we found is, for the short amount of time that we have, there's hopefully some impact that people will carry away. Obviously, it's
Yeah, because you have like
for some guys, for some guys it is, it's a longer process, but it opens up maybe an area in their own lives that they've really had to confront for the first time, because otherwise it was this secret, in the dark, not willing, not able to
sure.
share with anybody, right? I mean, that's often the issue that prevents men from coming out and coming forward, is the level of shame and embarrassment, or just like, well, it's just normal, I'm not doing anything wrong, even if I feel like maybe I'm not really happy with it, So The last.
Sorry, go ahead. And then I was.
Yeah, I just wanted to. Yeah, I wanted to mention another person that we've invited, and then maybe we can jump in a little bit to some of the reasons why. Yeah, how men think, why they buy sex, etc. Yeah. So the last presenter that we have is also a counselor and a therapist, and he really wants to help men if they want to take the next step forward to say, okay, what are some of the internal dynamics that happen in a man, when he goes through that cycle of, thinking about it, fantasizing about it, being on the fence, or maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, but then goes through the full cycle, decides to pay for sex, and then often comes out with a level of shame and, oh, I don't really even want to do this, but then 4 weeks later finds himself in the same position. So we really want to encourage men to say, okay, if you are ready for the next step, there is help, and don't just let it be, after the program is over, don't just think you're going to tackle this. If nothing changes in your life, you're not likely going to succeed in wanting to move forward from it.
Sure.
So that's the last guy that we have. Yeah, so you ask about how men think, why men buy sex. So there's a whole gamut of reasons why men buy sex. I think part of it is it's a very quick and an easy sexual encounter, right? Like for some men in their mind, it's a quick thing. It's an easy thing. I know I can either respond to an ad now, or I can drive down the street in certain areas of the city. I have 20 or 50 bucks, and this is a sure thing, right? Often there's no emotional or any kind of connection to that, right? It's strictly about the sex act, and there's no, I don't have to worry about her anymore after that, right? Whereas with my partner, maybe, she's not feeling well, or maybe, there's lots of stress happening in our lives or in her life, or maybe we've just sort of grown apart. So sometimes it's out of boredom, out of escape, just dealing with sort of the maybe drudgery of life that some people are in, and this is sort of their highlight or their thrill that they seek, but sometimes it's also maybe or finding somebody to do certain sex acts with that they normally wouldn't ask their wives or partners for, right? Maybe it's something that they've seen in porn, or something that they feel, and I want to do this, but I would never dare to ask my wife for that, right? And this is where we get into the area of sort of a level of control and dominance, right? So we're they're in charge of what happens, right? Like they're the ones who bring $50 and they get to decide what happens. And sometimes,
right.
I mean, in certain ways, it's always a level of abuse, but there's obviously different grades for men. But some, and have specifically indicated that in the program, that they do it because I get to decide what happens, which is, again, it's a very self-centered, egoistic, this is about me, about my pleasure, about maybe my fantasies. And I don't really care. You're just here to perform that.
Right.
I don't care how you feel or what this does to you,
Right.
Sometimes I would also say it's abuse experience for the men themselves, or sexual abuse that sort of puts them on a trajectory. Not all the time, but occasionally, I would say. I've had a fellow who came to me after the program was finished, and he says, you know what, I need to talk to you again, because after this program, things really went downhill with my wife and the relationship with her. And I realized that part of this was that I was abused as a child or as a teenager when he was in a hockey or in a sports club, and he said, I think that's part of why I went down this road. And I need to find some help, because I want to save the relationship with my wife, and I need to address this, So we were looking for some long-term counseling for him through the program. So again, it's different for different people, but I would say that's also the a possibility, because when you look at young people, when you look at young men, maybe teenagers, late teenage, early 20s, very few wake up one day and say, okay, today I want to, go and pay for a woman or pay for sex, right? It's obviously there's other pressures, that are coming in. Sometimes it's a rite of passage where maybe an uncle or even the dad says, hey, you know what, you're 16 now or 17. I'll pay for your hooker, kind of a deal, right?
Yeah,
So
I've heard of that. I've had clients that have done, their dads took them to a brothel to make
yeah,
them a man.
yeah,
And 20 years later, here they are paying for sex, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's also in certain areas where it's much more part of even of a work culture or a male culture, and maybe more so in the construction industry or sort of those typical male jobs, where there's already maybe a level of hostility or degrading language or views of women. Not
Yeah.
completely, but it sort of fosters this kind of mentality then, right? After the job is done, we'll go and have a couple of drinks, and then we'll go to the hookers. This kind of speech,
Yeah.
right?
Or the strip bar or the whatever.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And then obviously the impact of pornography plays a big role. I don't have any sort of solid numbers on that. It's a good question. We never specifically really asked it, but
you should have had that in your intake.
I know.
I bet you realize that later, right?
Yeah. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's so prevalent now, the impact of porn and just the availability of porn, right? To basically any age. If you have a device that has internet access, you have access to porn. Sometimes even inadvertently, right? Yeah. And so I would say that's definitely a factor that plays into it. Seeing that, being stimulated by it, and then saying, well, it's not enough for me just to see it on a screen and to masturbate to it, but I actually need to sort of live this out, this kind of stuff, as the driver of that. So I think there's definitely room to expand the intervention on that level. But you're right; it's much more prevalent than it was maybe 10 years ago, even. Yeah, and I think the other topic that maybe we can touch on is, what are some of the men's thoughts or ideas of why women are there, right? Why do women get involved? And we've heard this many times. Well, she's standing there on a corner, or she's putting up an ad online. Excuse me, she's putting up an ad online, and I'm just helping her, right? So she's there to provide a service. It's strictly transactional. She has something that I want. She's asking for money. I have the money. I'm willing to do it. So sort of, what's the big deal about it, right?
Yeah.
Without actually knowing or understanding some of the reasons why women end up in the first place in that industry. And the other time, sometimes it's also, they're there for my pleasure, right? So that mentality, she's there as a level of servitude, a level of, that this is my right, that I can do that,
Entitled. They feel entitled.
There's a sense of entitlement.
Women are objects.
That's right. Yeah, and sometimes, for a certain amount of people, I would say, they're legitimately looking for some sort of human or sexual connection in some form, right? I don't think it's the majority of it, because, like we said earlier, a majority of people is in a relationship. But I think they have sort of this sense that this will maybe fulfill a part of my life that is missing, right? And they sort of want this girlfriend experience,
Right.
like, yeah, she loves me, and and this kind of fantasizing around those kinds of topics,
Right.
And Yeah, sometimes it's also, I'm doing her a favor. I'm giving her money. This is how she can make an income. And
Supporting
she,
her.
she should thank me that I give her money, because that's the way how she pays the rent, or
Yeah.
for clothes or for other expenses.
Yeah.
So it's different. And often, because of the women often using this kind of, what I said, sort of this mask or this mirage, so almost telling men what they want to hear during the time that they're in, and sort of this kind of game, and this kind of playing with the men to I think, just in a sense, to distance themselves, because at the end, the women, under those economic pressures, have to make that money. And if she says, well, I don't really want to be here, then maybe he's gonna do something bad to her. I think that's not unheard of either. So it's very interesting to hear also from the women, and some of the dynamics. I think some unhealthy dynamics that are being played out in that. And I'm not blaming the women for that. I'm just saying that these are some of the things where it really damages both sides, of both buyers and sellers of sex.
But it sounds like everyone has to pretend.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
like I'm the woman and I'm pretending that I'm happy to see you. Oh, hi, sweetie, come on in, honey.
yeah, yeah.
What do you want to do today? And I know a certain percentage of men don't pretend anything except for what they're there for, which is to get you to do what I tell you because I'm paying.
Right,
But then
right.
maybe some men are playing along with it, like, oh, she's into me, she likes me, she
Yeah,
thinks I'm cute, she thinks I'm handsome, she thinks I'm whatever. And
yeah,
so it's they're all participating an illusion of
yeah,
some sort. And I part of me wonders, if you do that long enough, do you start to believe it a little bit too, right?
yeah,
Even from the buyer's side, like, because I've also had buyers say, like, I can tell just by looking at her that she doesn't want to be there.
yeah,
Like they have the capability of
yeah,
seeing that. And
yeah,
then but then they do it anyway. And then
yeah,
over time, maybe you choose not to see that, or you just
yeah.
dismiss it, or you just don't care.
Right.
Right. And you become more, I think buyers become more callous and lose their empathy over time. And so what is that doing to your soul, in a
Hmm.
sense, that you're
Hmm.
more callous and have less empathy? Like
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
that psychological impact as well.
Right.
Even to the women pretending and playing this game, it's so
Yeah.
inauthentic. It's like they're betraying themselves for so
Hmm.
long
Yeah.
that it takes a toll emotionally, because the emotional toll on women is tremendous. It's
Absolutely. Absolutely.
tremendous. It takes
Yeah.
many of them years to recover from being in the sex industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the experiential women that we have, I mean, some of them have been out like 10, 14 years, and they still say it's still sometimes a daily struggle, to stay on that path that they chose, because some of the the thoughts and the experience and the attitudes sort of come back, right? Especially when life gets tough, which for a lot of them, because of COVID, really has been, or other challenges.
So,
um, and so they, the ones that do well, they have a good support system. They have sort of solid relationships, maybe with a counselor, with a community, with people in their lives. But it's not that they've exited and after 4 years everything is sort of dandy. At least the ones that I've worked with, it's in some ways it's an ongoing struggle. But I see also incredible bravery, and tenacity, if they have exited, and to make it work. And I'm sure, if you had women that you talk to, it's pretty incredible. When you know their story and where they've come from, it's like, wow, you've been really, dedicated to your own recovery here.
well, yeah,
But
and the flip side of it is, like, after 10 years they still struggle. And
yeah,
then the other side of it is, when I've talked to people like Andrea on my YouTube channel and Jill, when I hear what they've been through, I'm like, I'm amazed that you're a functioning human being at all.
yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah,
good for you that you have a job and have a family and you
right,
function more or less during the day,
yeah,
because they've abused 10 lifetimes worth of trauma in 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think,
oh, sorry, go ahead. And then I want to ask you about the partners of the
yeah,
buyers to the degree that you've maybe had interaction with them or,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I wanna go back maybe to sort of to some of the feedback that we've gotten from the men after the program, which sort of relates
Okay.
back to um, sort of playing this role or getting so caught up in it that it eventually, I think, it deteriorates their own sense of self, but their own sort of sense of values of what is important to them. If you
Interesting.
ask if you ask them, what's important in your life when it comes to relationship or women, they would say, well, because they have women in their lives, their wives or their
Sure.
daughters, their aunts or their moms, and they say, well, yeah, I consider myself a good guy, and you should treat women with respect and those kinds of things. And yet they make themselves believe that by participating in sex buying, that these things go together, right? Or that they're not a contradiction. And the longer that they are, that the more dehumanizing their attitudes become to women in prostitution, even though they may be very loving wives or and loving husbands and loving their wives. And I find often that the arrest is sort of a wake up call, and they realize, hey,
Hmm.
I've really let my own values slip here, and because of my behavior and my thinking, it's
Hmm.
corroded of the person that I really wanted to be,
Yeah. Hmm.
and so it's like a big stop sign, and a wall is built up in front of them that says, stop, you need to reconsider your choices here for
Right.
yourself. And some of the men have done that and have reflected that with us at the end and says, you know what, I kind of knew it, but I didn't really want to believe it, or I did, the other part was so much more important,
Okay.
but then also hearing from the women, hearing the impact that this has, hearing that often women in prostitution die or are missing, are murdered, right? Like it's very emotional, and realizing that they are part of an industry that contributes to that. A lot of guys will say, I didn't know, or choose not to know, choose not to really dig a
Right.
little bit deeper into
Willfully blind
it.
about the willfully.
Right. The willful blindness, right? And to say, well, it doesn't really concern me, right? It's just me and her. She wants to be there, etc. So that's often the feedback that we get is sort of that emotional impact, and when they realize, something has taken over that is a compromise to their own sense of self and values, and they want to be decent guys, and I would imagine most of them are. They're not sort of the creepy guy that comes out of the swamp. It's regular day-to-day guys, that do this kind of stuff,
Right.
and so hopefully, for most of them, they'll take something away and say, hey, I really want to consider this, and not be part of that anymore, so
Yeah. Good.
you had asked me about the partners. That's a good topic to dive into, and I can only sort of share some anecdotes that we've seen. So we had one session where we had one gentleman who was part of the program, and his wife actually came with him to the
Wow.
program.
Wow.
So we she asked us, is it okay if she attends? And we said to her, this is your call. You're welcome to stay. We sort of explained to her what would happen, the amount of men that would be in there, the topics that we would discuss. And she was encouraged, I think, by her children, who were like adult children already at that time. And so I think they, when he was arrested and the car was impounded, he had no choice but to disclose it. So the family knew about it. And I think for her, it was important to kind of see and learn more about the whole thing, and recognize what he had been involved in. So she was, I think, incredibly brave to come to that, and to listen and to watch the seminar. And funny enough, or I don't know if it was funny for them, it was the day of their anniversary that this seminar happened, right?
Yeah,
So
I wasn't very familiar with her.
but she carried it with an incredible amount of dignity, and and I think in some ways good for him for being so transparent with her, because often I hear from the guys, either they're super scared about ever telling their wives and they never ever want this to come out, and they ask me, so can I just not talk about this? And I said, well, if you get if you go to the US or to another country and they ask you, have you ever been arrested, you would have to say yes, right? So they're very scared, and others, the other group is like, no, I need to tell my wife or my partner about this, because this is,
Yeah.
if I don't do this, that relationship is going to end, and I need to, again, being guided by those values, I need to tell her so that this doesn't stay a secret, and that I'm honest with her, and obviously,
what percentage of men do tell their wives, do you think?
yeah, I would say probably about 25 to 30%. That's my guess.
That's it, eh? The
Yeah,
rest,
well,
they
from what I know, I mean, I
Yeah.
always encourage them to do, whether they do or not. That's
okay. Yeah.
that's their call in the end.
Mhm.
But I've had a couple of also intake meetings, again, where the men have to take responsibility, and then sometimes the wife sits in the intake, whether it's to
Oh, she
translate or
does.
just if again, I leave it up to the guy. I said, if you want to bring your wife, that's okay, but I say, we're going to talk about this whole thing. We sort of, we need to expose that. So so often it is for men who need a translator, because we have a fair amount of newcomers in the program, where language sometimes is a bit of an issue. And so we have women, and then when they realized, because the guy would have maybe said to her, oh, this is all a misunderstanding, but I can take this program, and then, my charges are dealt with. But when they realize, and I ask them, so, did you talk to her? Did you say, you would pay $20 for a blowjob? And they come forth with that, you can often see just the devastation on the partner's face, right? Obviously, and I think it's a huge break in the trust between the two of them.
Oh, absolutely. You would destroy all the trust that you've built right there.
Right.
Yeah.
But I've also seen, like, I've seen that, but I've also seen where women or both of them stick it out, and again, whatever conversations they have, once they leave my office, I don't know, but when I say to her, or when I meet with him again at the end, and I say, so, how's the relationship between you and your wife, they'll say, well, she was obviously very upset, she's angry, but I want to rebuild that trust, and there's often kids involved, obviously, and so there's a level of commitment. Now, I've also seen it where relationships end because of this kind of stuff,
I would imagine.
obviously, but I think, what I appreciate if a guy has enough courage and guts to say, okay, I'm going to talk to my wife about this, and I'm going to be as open as I can, and I'm going to tackle this head on, and I'm going to hope she's going to stick with me and we can make this work. But that's the best that I have, So I appreciate those guys, because I say, well, you sort of screwed this up, but you can do a lot more damage if you don't tell her about this right now,
Do you refer to counseling services for?
If they ask me, particularly at the end, if they would ask me, or if they say, hey, you know what, we want to do some either some couples counseling, or if the guy realizes, hey, there's a lot of stuff in himself, whether it's depression, anxiety, anger, substance abuse, I say, okay, well, let's find you something here that you can connect with, and somebody, so that you can address those other issues as well, right? So,
what do you think about, in some countries, they publish the names and photographs of the guys that are arrested? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and to be fully honest, I'm I'm personally not a huge fan of that. I know it's been used in the U.S. in quite a number of cities. It's part of their strategy, sort of this public shaming element.
Hmm.
Is it working? Maybe, possibly. I just find, I don't know, when you put somebody up there, you also maybe, then somebody will recognize him, and then there's family members. So I'm if somebody can convince me that it works, I'd be willing to reconsider my stance on it. But I'm not a huge fan of it, to be quite honest.
When you
So
say it works, you mean as a deterrent
yeah,
to
as
other
a
sex
deterrent, yeah.
buyers?
Yeah, I mean it's obviously a huge thing if all of a sudden you see your name on a billboard, or you see your name, or not just your name, but your photograph on a billboard or on a website. I mean, that's like, who wants that kind of stuff, So in that sense, it would probably make it then, because then it's a more of a deterrent. But yeah, I'm not sure. I read a study somewhere that I think unless it's actually prison right off the bat for the first offense,
Right.
most people wouldn't really consider changing their behavior. So
Right.
I don't know what you think of it, given the experience that you have.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, it would just create a lot of more shame,
Yeah,
and shame doesn't really create lasting change, although
right,
it can be a catalyst. Like, a lot of guys end up in my office and because of a lot of shame, and they're afraid of losing their marriage, for example.
right.
But I don't use shame as a primary motivating force, because it's a toxic emotion.
Yeah,
And so I want to help get guys out of shame as fast as they can. And that's different from remorse. Okay.
right.
That's different. Remorse or guilt is appropriate. Yeah, and I don't know. I'd have to look at and see if there are some studies that are done in terms of, it being a deterrent. I'm thinking
Yeah,
there's certain crimes where we do publish names. We have court
right.
dockets where we publish names of people that have just gone to court.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and I'm not sure why we do that.
yeah,
There's a history there. I don't know what it is. It's just that you publish a name and photograph of somebody, you're instantly destroyed their business, their
right.
reputation.
Yeah,
They'll probably lose their job.
yeah,
And it might drive some to suicide, because I'm sure
right.
you probably had guys that have talked about, I'm just going to do myself in anyway, right? In your program, does that come up?
We had, it doesn't happen very often, but we've had one actually just about 2 years ago. So,
Right.
and we wanted to make sure that he realized, okay, we can help him. There's some services, and even though this is bad, but it shouldn't be that bad that he considers ending his own life.
Well, I went to a workshop a few years ago, and they had a cop. He's not a cop anymore, but he worked in the morality unit, they call it in Sweden.
Mhm.
And they have the Nordic model there. So he was the guy when they ran the stings. The
Right.
female officer would pose as an escort doing in calls to the motel.
Yeah.
And he would be in the room beside with a couple other guys. And then because you have to offer money for a sex act, that's what has to happen. And then
Yeah.
once those words are spoken, they come in and arrest the guy.
Mhm.
And a lot of them were right away, I'm done. I'm going to just kill myself. Like,
Yeah.
you hear that all the time. And I think,
Right.
I'm not sure, but I think they publish there in Sweden.
Right.
I think they do publish names. Anyways, not to get sidetracked too much on that. I just wondered what you thought. But okay, so
Yeah.
let's kind of take the last sort of 10 minutes and talk about outcomes of the John schools.
Mhm. Mhm.
Are they worth it? Do you have a recidivism rate that you can give
Mhm.
us? And then, and then maybe touch on what we need to do as a society, as individuals, and as a society to address this issue. I mean, this
Yeah.
is prostitution in 2021 in our
Yeah.
country right now, going
Yeah.
on everywhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say from the feedback that I've gotten in individual meetings, as well as when we do, at the end of the seminar, we ask for an evaluation to be filled out, and so obviously that's the feedback that we get from the guys. And I would say a fair amount of, I think a significant amount of people are impacted by the information and by the stories that they've heard, or the impact that it could have on their own future, whether it's work or traveling, or the women being impacted, children being exploited and being lured, so those kinds of things, I think they do create an impact on people, and we notice from those surveys, where we feel like, okay, this is meaningful, and we obviously need to be aware of that it's doesn't reach everybody, but I think you have to be sort of a pretty hardened, person with a heart of steel, or ice, like an ice castle where it doesn't reach you anymore, where these stories don't impact you anymore, and you show no empathy or no sort of sense of, wow, I didn't know that I'm contributing to this. Regarding the recidivism rates, we actually did a study, or a bit of a like a recidivism study around the types of or the numbers of when people get rearrested, and we found that people who were participating in the program and completed it had about the same. Well, people who didn't complete the program or were not eligible for it had a higher rate of charges in general, whether that's assault or administrative charges or some other criminal involvement. So the overall package. And when we looked at the men themselves who had participated in the program, I think we were looking at about a 10% recidivism rate. Now that's being rearrested for a similar or for the same offense. That is low, but it doesn't fully capture. It doesn't fully capture sort of the whole picture. We also did then a study with the police, where sometimes police will come across somebody, but the person is actually not arrested, but they're circling, what the police call circle jerks. So they are in an area, and it's clear that they're not looking for a specific address or so, or they're not just driving through, but they circle around the block in search of women, right? So, and then the police can stop him and say, hey, what are you doing here? And often it'll be apparent that he's looking for a woman. So that's another sort of indicator. And that is actually higher. So people are more often doing this kind of stuff if they were not in a program than if they were in the program. So I think it does make an impact. I think it does create a level of change that it's worth to continue that. Yeah. Is it the only thing that should be done? Absolutely not, because you still, like you said, it's happening across the country, and it's happening right now here in Winnipeg and maybe in your city. So I think the approaches need to be wider than that, but I think it's absolutely critical that it needs to still be enforced. And I highly disagree with people that feel like decriminalizing or not enforcing at all would make it safer. I think it's misguided. I think it's not based on reality. And I think it does a disservice to the women that are involved in the sex trade, because it would basically, again, push the guys in, like, okay, it's allowed now, and as long as we can make it safer, well, certain things you just can't make safe. It's not the law that creates the violence; it's actual people, often men, and often buyers. Yes. Yeah, it's not the law itself. Obviously, it impacts it, but the law itself doesn't create the violence. Right. It's people that do that. So I think it's necessary. I think it also, sort of sends a message as a level of deterrence. but it's certainly not the only thing. And when we look at the reasons or the age when men start to buy sex, I think, those late teens, early 20s, and maybe you have from your own practice experience in when does somebody start to pay for sex. What I've read is the younger they are, the more likely is that they will do that in their older years. If they start sort of past 25, then they're less likely to make this a regular habit for themselves.
Okay,
Whereas
I'm
if
not sure, but that
so
sounds right.
so I think and we live in a culture of sort of hypersexualization, pornography, all of this stuff, right? Which is I think it puts youth and young people on a trajectory that is really kind of dangerous, I think, for their own well-being. I think it creates a normalcy, where women are expected to perform certain sex acts because they've seen that, as a teenager on porn, and it creates a pressure for men to do this kind of stuff, and that level of mutuality and mutual respect for each other, and this negotiation and talking about and feeling things out, what feels right and what is okay in on that sexual level of the relationship. I think it's totally skewed. So when somebody is a girl is feeling pressured or feels like, oh yeah, I have to give my boyfriend of 2 weeks a blowjob when I'm 16, like, okay, just because I have this image and in porn is what being portrayed.
Right.
So I think those are sort of the areas that I think young men and men are being sort of neglected, or being led astray. And you referenced Gail Dines earlier, right? So I think the sort of normative system and the value system when it comes to sexuality is really heavily influenced by the porn industry.
Yeah, she has a great talk called How Porn Creates the John. And it basically, all of the things that need to be present for you to pay for sex are in pornography and taught by pornography.
Yeah.
So porn teaches you how to think so that you can then go buy sex.
Right.
Yeah, she lays it out. Okay, so real quickly, any final thoughts of what we can do as a society? Like I hear you say we need to address the porn issue, the accessibility, the demand, get to kids young in terms of educating them, get law enforcement on board to actually enforce the laws, get social services, counselors, maybe faith communities together to help.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything?
I think to seeing men as allies or partners in this, and even though the program, works with men who are arrested, right, where there's a certain level of force that the state implicates on these men, I think to say, okay, it's us versus them, or it's men against women, and women are always the victim and men are always the perpetrators, I think is not helpful. But to say, okay, a lot of men don't buy sex. They may consume pornography, but they don't buy sex, right? So, but they still have an influence on other guys, So this level of, okay, this is not only an issue for us, but we can be a partner to women. We can help each other out and have conversations around pornography and even what we desire in a relationship. Not just when it comes to sex, but in everything. And being willing and being able and creating spaces that, like what you're doing here with your podcast, right? To discuss what that means for men. And I think men have to take a leadership for their own, for other men and other younger men, particularly in leadership positions of companies. You can implement a policy for your staff, around pornography access, on your Wi-Fi or on your computer network, those kinds of things, right? And to, like you said, not to come at it from sort of a shame, sort of with a waving finger, but to say, hey, look at this, and because these are important conversations to have, and I think most men want to have decent mutual relationships, and are often not fulfilled, man. So many guys say at the end, it was never really fulfilling. It wasn't even that good when I paid for sex,
Yeah,
It,
yeah,
like
I hear that
I
a
was
lot.
I was so focused on it, and then when it was over, it's like, whoa, what was
Yeah,
this all about, and it
yeah,
leaves them a sense of emptiness and a sense of unfulfilled, So,
yeah,
but it's important, I think, that men are capable of talking about those things, and that we create the spaces to do that. So that would be, I think, one of my other suggestions on this. So like a podcast like yours is a very, very helpful tool and vehicle to do that. So
yeah. Well, I mean, my goal is to have conversations about these things. Like we all
yeah,
know what goes on. We have to talk
yeah,
about it. We have to
yeah,
articulate the issues, what's really going on, and solutions, and
yeah,
and do it in a way that's dignified and respectful, but
yeah,
honest.
yeah,
Let's not minimize it. Let's not gloss it over.
yeah,
This issue's been around for thousands of years, and we need to figure this out.
yeah,
To end sexual exploitation and inequality in general.
yeah,
Let's
yeah,
figure out, in thousands of years in human history, here we still are. We still have not figured out an answer to this problem. And
yeah,
maybe in our generation we can. Who knows,
yeah,
right?
yeah. We can certainly do our part to it. So
We can do our part. Thanks, Hannah, so much. I really appreciate the time. You're sharing your expertise and your insight with my audience. And thanks again for what you've done, and keep up the good work. I know you're no longer running the John schools, but keep up the good work in whatever you're
yeah,
doing. And
yeah.
yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I'm hoping to stay involved with the whole topic, and we might start a project with an agency here in the city to keep the focus on some of those issues that I've
Yeah,
mentioned. And yeah, thank you for inviting me and speaking with me and sharing those things. So thanks for your podcast as well, and
yeah,
all your work. So I think it's probably really fascinating, the stuff that you hear.
it is. Well, thanks, and keep me in mind if I can help in any way with any future projects you're working on. Let's stay in
Yeah,
touch. Okay.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Take
Okay.
care.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Bye.
Bye.